Yeah, welcome back to another podcast on the queer column. Today we have Professor Oishik with us, and Smriti will be taking us through the initial steps of the podcast. Smriti, please go ahead. You're muted. Yeah.
Yeah. So hello everyone. We have Professor Oishik Sircar. Currently, he is a professor in Jindal Global Law School, and he has written a lot of academic work on like queer theories and contemporary queer movements that are going on. And this particular podcast will be focused a little bit on his uh, newly released book, that's Violent Modernities, and on in it we have a specific chapter, that's chapter 4, new queer politics. So we'll be delving deeper into the arguments of that chapter, and we'll be getting more perspective on how the queer politics is currently in the contemporary context. And also we'll have some discussion about the uh, same-sex marriage proceedings which are going currently in the Supreme Court. So I hope we can begin with this.
Sure. Professor, have we missed something that you would like to add to that?
No, sounds good.
Sure. As Smriti has already mentioned, going ahead with the first question we had was with regards to your new book, Violent Modernities, and the arguments that have been advanced in the book itself. So, especially in chapter 4, as Smriti was mentioning about new queer politics and what is specifically meant by new queer politics, if you could brief us on that.
Okay, so the book is not as new as I'd want it to be. So the book came out in 2021, but it seems new to me as well because it was kind of in the middle of the pandemic year. Not that the pandemic is gone, but the sense of the dread was quite palpable at that time. So I didn't necessarily see the publication as a moment for rejoicing or celebrating. Um, um, not only that, I don't think the book necessarily speaks to things that are rejoiceable or celebratory. So the mood of the writing, as I do speak about it in the preface, is quite grim. Um, um, but the question that you've asked about what I mean by new queer politics has much to do with the second title of the book. So the book's called Violent Modernities, Cultural Lives of Law in the New India. And unlike a monograph, which follows kind of a singular line of argument and builds on that argument as a book unfolds, Violent Modernities is a collection of academic essays on a disparate set of topics, and each of the chapters try and offer, a way of thinking about the relationship between law and culture in something that I'm calling the New India, which is both a temporal marker, um, but it's also an ideological marker for me. So new queer politics maps onto the idea of the New India. So what is the New India? And an explanation for that might help us understand what is new queer politics. Um, um, so what I mean by New India in the book is a concentrated moment where a lot of things were happening. And this concentrated moment is around, there's a specific year marker, but the moment is slightly more wider in temporal terms than that. So the year marker is 1991. That's when it's widely known to be the year in which the Indian economy opens up. Something called liberalization, privatization, globalization is embraced as state policy. But it wasn't just that 1991 stood for. It was kind of a fulcrum between something that came immediately prior to 1991 and something that comes immediately after 1991. So what came prior to 1991 were two key things. One was the implementation of reservations that took about 10 years to implement, resulting in a certain kind of upper caste backlash and anxiety, characterized by the kind of upper caste protests that were carried out, say, in many university campuses. And while this was happening in Delhi, for example, where a Delhi University student, an upper caste student, put himself on fire. Even upper caste women took out, protest rallies against the VP Singh government decision to implement the Mandal Commission report's recommendations. Alongside that, the Indian government was doing something else, which is military presence in Kashmir was, was entering an unprecedented phase. So in the late 80s and the early 90s, there was a decisive shift in the way in which the Indian government's role in Kashmir really took on the role of becoming an occupation in the way we understand what is an occupation. And this gets followed by LPG, which, at a certain level is presented as a celebratory moment, right? It's the moment that will usher India into a global club of prosperity of sorts. Although one knows that it's a certain kind of, economic crisis that resulted in the 1991 war. But the crisis was repurposed for presenting it as if this was a moment that was inaugurating a more prosperous, shining India in the future. Now, immediately after the 1991 moment comes 1992, the demolition of the Babri Masjid, followed by the riots in Bombay primarily, but also in many other parts of India. Now, one could think about these as disparate events that have taken place coincidentally around a similar time. But as the book tries to make a case, I do see these as connected events, not as if they were connected in the form of a pre-planned, arrangement, but the fact that they happened in such close temporal proximity to each other produced a certain way of living, or produced a certain kind of effect that had an indelible mark on the way in which questions of culture and rights and politics were now being played out in India. Now, if this is somewhat, for me, the inaugural moment of what I'm calling the new India, what kind of an impact does this consolidation of a certain kind of, Bahujan assertion at the level of electoral politics, resulting in upper caste backlash, accompanied by India demonstrating a certain kind of unprecedented military might in Kashmir, accompanied by the rise of Hindu nationalism, not only in terms of rhetoric, but a certain kind of material demonstration of its violent abilities in the demolition of the Babri Masjid. What do these do to the way in which queer politics start getting played out, say, a decade from that time? The argument that I make in that chapter called New Queer Politics is that queer politics in India doesn't remain immune to these impacts inaugurated at that kind of early 1990s moment. And the chapter traces some of the ways in which I think the impact can be seen, both in terms of the way in which caste consolidations, Hindutva, and neoliberalism, as well as militarism, come together to offer ways of thinking about queer politics in India. And I can elaborate further as we continue with our conversation.
So, Professor, just following up on that, I think what we are really interested in knowing is how law with a capital L and with a lowercase l, as you have mentioned in your book, how both these combined led to a change in perception of people with regards to queer identities, especially why we have seen a huge mass movement which has tried to gather support for queer identities in India. However, we don't see that seeping in at the grassroots level. I think that's a question that we have been dealing with in the same-sex marriage petitions as well. So, what do you think of that, and how does it fit within the new queer politics?
So, as I do, mention in that chapter, I don't think that there is a queer movement in India which speaks in one voice, which is, in agreement with what it means to be queer to begin with, whether the word queer in itself is an adequate description for those who consider themselves outside of the heteronormative arrangements, both in identitarian and cultural and religious terms. What we have seen in the legal arena, particularly with regard to the mobilizations around, the anti-377 campaigns, is a specific group of people leading that campaign, which is a significant campaign and resulted, of course, in a victorious outcome in the reading down of the section, despite several difficulties that were faced in the run-up to that moment. So whether that movement has had an impact on the way in which queer lives are experienced and lived in very many parts of India, the answer to that question, just in sociological terms, is no, it hasn't, because it's indeed been a very small group of people leading a very specific kind of campaign in locations where a certain set of concerns gain precedence for queer folks above other kinds of concerns. So where queerness becomes the primary identity on the basis of which you are, running this campaign. But queerness might not necessarily be the primary identity for many queer people, or it needn't be the primary identity all the time for all queer persons. So I think in the context of the the marriage equality, conversations that are happening now, and the center's characterization that this demand is an urban elite demand is also, in a certain sense, empirically vacuous. There is no data to back up whether it's elite or not. Um, um, so one can, for example, argue quite strongly against such a rhetoric, which simply put is a rhetoric built on prejudice. But while that may be the case, it is also true that if we are thinking about who's leading, or who previously led the anti-377 campaigns, or the folks at the forefront of the marriage equality, petitions, we know who these folks are. We know that they carry a certain kind of cultural capital to be able to, take this to its conclusion. Now, one could say part of that is strategic. You need people in positions of power who can wield certain kinds of authority to lead, law reform campaigns. Whether it's a movement is something that I remain skeptical about. I don't think one can call it a movement, because a movement is a far more broad-based formation. And so, although much has happened since the writing of the chapter in the context of queer politics in India, I still think India doesn't really have a queer movement. There are many queer experiences, and what's quite clear about the conversations that are happening now is that on the one hand you have these marriage equality demands that are given a certain kind of visibility, both by the Supreme Court itself, but also social media and the media in general. But then you also have trans activists demanding horizontal reservations who are facing police lathi charge. And so we, it's quite apparent there, what emerges as a priority that requires attention from certain sections of Indian society, including the judiciary as well as the media, and certain other kinds of demands that don't. And one could say both trans people on the one hand and those who think that they're going to be the primary beneficiaries of marriage equality, on the other hand, fall within the large queer umbrella. But clearly, the nature of benefits that will accrue to these groups are going to be, very different, incomparable. I mean, one could say that, yes, we'll have a formal right in place, which in itself is an important achievement. So, I'm all in favor of the demand for marriage equality succeeding, but we know that from a certain kind of pragmatic or realist perspective, what the outcome of that will be.
Yeah, Professor, just I think this has been very recently also taken up by Dalit scholars like Akhil Kang, and has also been discussed by V. Huram, where they talk about how certain people can be the leaders of the queer movement, and because you're queer, you get to be casteless, and that is a privilege that can only be afforded to people who belong to the Savarna castes. So the question that we have, and I think you've mentioned this in your book as well, that the queer movement itself has an intersection of many identities coming together. How do we reshape the queer movement that exists as it is now, to make at least the judiciary and the legislature understand that a one-stop solution for everybody is actually not going to work out? Especially, we have seen in Naftage also that there was a complete lack of analysis on what is actually going to happen to people who do not belong to the Savarna caste, and how that will trickle down in the society. So yeah, just that.
Right. So I don't have an answer to that question. And I don't have an answer to that question in all honesty, because I'm not an active participant anymore in, whatever little campaigning or mobilizing work that I used to do, on the basis of which this chapter was written. So in both practically and ethically, I am inadequately placed to offer strategic suggestions for what the movement should do. I think there are far better qualified people, qualification not in terms of educational qualification, but in terms of the kind of movement wisdom that people have, who are better placed, much better placed than me, to offer such suggestions. And you've already spoken about Bikram or Akil Kang, but there's so many others, uh, whose voices, I think, whose wisdom about what might be the ways in which we can make the judiciary consider some of these complicated questions need to be heard. I mean, I would possibly say, from a more theoretical point of view, is that you can never have all-inclusive rights claims. And it's a point that I do make in the book, not only in this chapter, but in other chapters as well, particularly in the opening chapter called Spectacles of Emancipation, which is a critique of liberal rights claims in India's legal discourse. And it's a very simple point. I mean, the point is this, that whenever we make a rights claim, the claim is made to a political entity. This political entity is called the state. If you're considering rights claims being made under so-called democratic conditions. Now, when you're making this rights claim to this political entity called the state, you have to make this rights claim as a rights bearer, or somebody who's a potential rights bearer. Now, to be a potential rights bearer, you will have to use a word to describe who you are. So you'll have to call yourself something, give yourself and the group that you're a part of a name. And on that basis, the demand will be met by the state or not met by the state, based on whether the demand is made in a compelling fashion, or the state considers it is important to recognize that demand at that stage, so on and so forth. But in constituting yourself as a potential rights-bearing collective of people, you would have already had to draw a line around your identity that requires that kind of rights protection. So, in a certain sense, drawing that line is an exclusive arrangement, right? So you're demanding rights for an exclusive group of people who are identified through a singular, identity as such. So we can never have a rights claim that is all inclusive. That's, I mean, and one could say the tragedy of rights claim, that it can never be made in all-inclusive terms. I mean, we all speak about inclusion, but that it's almost an impossible normative idea. So when the first rights claim succeeds, we know that a lot of people get left out, even when it succeeds after the recognition has been made by the state. And then there are attempts to try and, for example, expand the boundaries of that category that's been recognized. And sometimes that expansion fails, and the so-called rights demands made, by queer groups in India is quite a paradigmatic illustration of this arrangement. But one would see that even in the case of other kinds of rights demands, and that parallel to what is happening now, which is taking up so much media space, over the past year or so, there's been this debate about whether the scheduled caste category should include Dalit Muslims and Christians. And it is the logic there is also the same, irrespective of whether you support or don't support whether the SC category should be expanded. The logic is that initial recognition was for a specific group of people, and that recognition required excluding other groups of people. And now that category, the debate is whether the category can be expanded to include groups who were not considered part of the SC category when that recognition came. So I use a word in the opening chapter called pharmacon. It's a word that means something that is both medicine and poison at the same time. And I think all rights claims carry that characteristic, that they are medicine for some and poison for others. And we can never consider rights claims or even victories based on rights claims as those that will necessarily be, all inclusive. That's an impossibility.
Thank you, Professor. One thing that we brought up earlier as well, and I think you discover in the third chapter, which is about cinema and Bollywood and how they impact certain perceptions. Although you have written it in context of the Gujarat riots, I think what we would like to know is how the changes in how cinema right now, as well as let's say the silver screen, where you're seeing a lot of series which talk about queer politics and as well as queer identities. How do you think that is impacting our societal perceptions? Because again, this is really limited to a certain section of the society who even have the privilege of gathering these resources or even looking at these resources. And similarly, even if you go through these resources, mostly you would see that there's a very homogeneous idea of what a queer identity looks like, and you would never see an intersection of identities happening at the same time. So do you think that we have at least moved a step ahead in how we look at our cinema and how we show perceptions, or are we still stuck behind?
So um, I think your question offers, ways of considering representation in a way where just because we see new kinds of identities being represented in cinema doesn't necessarily mean that the conditions of the lives of these people have necessarily become better. And that I think that would be a case, one could make that argument in case of law as well, that just because we have better laws that protects the rights of newer groups of marginalized people, that we will see that their lives have automatically gotten better. So I see representation in cinema and representation in law somewhat operating in a similar fashion. If we think about what makes people's lives better, there is, for example, a structuralist response to that question, which is to say it gets better when people mobilize en masse. you know, and make revolutionary demands. And I'm not saying this merely in rhetorical terms, but you know, um, uh, major shifts are are initiated at least through mass movements. And yet we see that despite the kind of revolutionary demands or revolutionary imaginations that mass movements might set out for us, the eventuality in the face of an increasingly violent state um, under democratic conditions is a, a forceful crushing of that imagination. And, you know, the Narmada Bachao Andolan, for example, is one instance of what, you know, an extremely successful mass movement might in fact yield, which is, you know, in material terms, a failed outcome. But that doesn't mean that the revolutionary vision is a failure. It's a failure in terms of effecting the kind of policy or legal reform that revolutionary demand intended. So I don't think representation in itself is good enough. It's good, you know, it's good. It's good, especially in the context of cinema, because cinema, at least to a certain extent, offers opportunities for using these instances for beginning conversations in settings where these conversations might not have happened before. For example, on the dinner table in a conservative, middle-class Hindu family, upper caste family, for example, where, you know, it might be a Sunday ritual to go out and watch a film in a multiplex, and you go and watch, say, Badhai Do, for example. You know, I haven't watched the film, but it, I guess, garnered some positive reviews in the way in which it represented queer characters, and that can be a good opportunity to have conversations with parents, for example, who you know, who might not have had, you know, the opportunity to either open up to their own children, or for children to not open up to their parents. I think the cinema offers that that easy possibility, and I think that potential is an important potential. But we also know that, as your question suggested, a lot of this representation of queerness is also closely associated with certain kinds of caste, class, religious packaging. So, and because I haven't kept up with a lot of the recent films, my reference will be to a precursor to this in the form of a music video that I discuss in chapter 4, which is a music video that was put out by the UN. And Salina Jaitley, featured in the video. It was a Bollywood style music video. It shows that this pretty rich Indian family where preparations are being made for the couple's arrival. And when finally the couple arrives, it's two men. And the camera then focuses on the face of the grandmother, and she has a kind of stern demeanor. And then finally she smiles, and it's back to dancing and celebrating. So it's a good ending, and I'm quite sure that one can use that music video to start a conversation inside domestic places where one would have found it difficult to speak to some family members, perhaps. But the fact that the location of a certain kind of queer inclusivity is the joint in the family, not only it's a joint Hindu family, it's a joint Hindu family with a particular kind of elite aesthetic dispensation. Might actually create experience.
How cinema could initiate conversations at
Right.
unconventional.
Right. So I was speaking about the UN equal rights video, which features Selena Jaitley, and I was saying that while on the one hand it can actually offer possibilities for using that video to start conversations within unlikely, domestic spaces where such conversations might have been difficult. But the narrative of inclusivity that is being shown in a video like that can also create a deep sense of alienation for a lot of queer folks whose, sense of life might be absolutely unrelated to what the video is showing. But at the same time, I also don't. So as I was saying, so there's this kind of structuralist approach to thinking about what would make our lives better. Our not in a homogeneous sense, but in terms of what would change deep arrangements of oppression. And the structuralist approach is about thinking with what mass mobilization can do, despite the fact that we see most instances of mass mobilization ending in failure. And as Violent Modernities itself ends on a note of failure. And I speak about failure in the closing of the book, not as a sentiment of not as a sentiment of giving up, but as a certain kind of ethic, is that not achieving a desired movement goal might not necessarily be an effective register on the basis of which one can evaluate the success of movements. So the structuralist approach is one approach, but there are also other approaches that one can think with, where if a structuralist approach tells me that the problem with the Selena Jaitley video is that it emboldens structures of oppression in capitalism and caste and dominant Hindu religious arrangements in a domestic family setting. I think in the context of cinema, one can make space outside of the structuralist approach for something like fantasy. And I think it's important to recognize that possibility that cinema opens up. So seldom do we watch mainstream films with the objective of a representation of reality, right? We don't necessarily feel good about watching a film that represents reality very well. If that was the case, we wouldn't have a Pathan doing what it is doing, or what it did at the moment of its release, which was phenomenal and fantastic. The space of the cinema hall itself turned into a space of forms of celebration that one hadn't experienced for a long time in a movie theater. And I didn't watch Pathan in a movie theater, and I regret missing out on that experience. And I watched it much later when it released on an OTT platform, and I think it's a shitty film. It's a really it's a really bad film. And I'm a huge Shah Rukh Khan fan. I'm such a huge Shah Rukh Khan fan that my tolerance threshold for Shah Rukh Khan films are really high. And so I did watch the film in its entirety. Um, enjoyed it simply because it's a Shah Rukh Khan fan. But I also see the importance of what the fantastical, absurdist imagination of that shitty film can do in the space of the movie theater under certain circumstances, like the specific time at which Pathan released, for example. So I think so one cannot undermine and what in a certain sense, Pathan, what is it, there were a lot of people reading Pathan in very different ways. So of course there were the ones who were thinking about the Shah Rukh Khan figure as the quintessential figure of the complicated identity of the Indian. Him being asked the question by Deepika Padukone in one scene, are you Muslim? And he doesn't answer that question, and he offers a backstory about how uh, uh, a family in Afghanistan saved his life, so on and so forth. So of course there are those kind of complicated tellings that are part of the film, but it's also at a certain level a story of patriotism, right? And sometimes deeply problematic patriotism that takes resort to the armed might of the political formation of the state. So if I'm reading Pathan from a structuralist point of view, I will only end up seeing it as a problematic film. But if I suspend my structuralist, frameworks of analysis, even temporarily, I might get transported into this, land of absurdist fantasy that will give me joy. And I think in the way in which we think about what makes our lives better, that particularly naive question, but I think an almost unanswerably, profoundly naive question. Are these kind of moments where we don't always let our cognitive capacities lead the way in which we move through the world? Sometimes where you let go of the over-analyzing capacity of the mind and let go of that and make space for the way in which the affective intensity of the body take over your experience of something. And I think this is where queer politics becomes so important, because queer politics, while on the one hand, and I'm not saying that there is only one kind of queer politics, but broadly speaking, the fact that queer politics is able to foreground the question of desire, and not just sexual desire, but desire as something that cannot always be understood in rational terms, offers us both at macro and micro levels some really generative possibilities of what does it mean to live an ethically fulfilling life. That sometimes our demand for structuralist critique is in fact a hindrance, that we might not be able to see how do we experience a sense of joy by just holding hands and feeling the touch of the skin of another person at a protest march, where you've done all the sloganeering that you could, but it's just that moment of holding hands before people leave for their homes that offers the most intense sensation of whatever might be called hope. So I think for me, in conceptual terms, queer theory opens up the possibility of taking the insignificant seriously, things that don't necessarily will result in political outcomes, right? Because we tend to always measure the worth of political action on the basis of whether it's able to achieve its promise. And when it doesn't, then we say, this strategy was unhelpful. So in that sense, even the most stereotypical representations of queerness in Bombay cinema or any other kind of cinema, for example, that we might actually cringe at because it, solidifies certain kinds of prejudices rather than opening up possibilities, might offer, possibilities for viewers where you can kind of take these leaps of imagination and momentarily feel that you've entered a world which is different from the one that you live in. And I think suspension of that demand for reality from cinema is an unfair way of reading cinema. I think cinema is cinema because it does not do the work of representing reality. If it did, then cinema wouldn't be cinema. And I just to make a connection here to something that will bring the law back into conversation is that the larger debates around representations of sex in cinema, and particularly if you think about a genre like pornography, the debate really has been this, so that if you have a genre like pornography, would that be the script for people to use to continue forms of oppression, sexual oppression, directed at women, for example, given that pornography mostly depicts, or mainstream pornography mostly depicts heterosexual sexual arrangements. And of course, the structuralist reading of pornography, if we think about the works of scholars like Catherine McKinnon, would suggest that yes, it is the script. It's the script that then gets followed in real life to normalize, say, forms of sexual violence. But we've also had kind of, sex radical queer feminists who've made the argument that why confuse fantasy and reality? And why limit the ways in which we can actually fantasize? Why cannot, for example, certain forms of violence be part of our imaginations of fantasy? So I think sometimes, so while structuralist ways of reading how we mobilize against arrangements of oppression are really important and cannot be given up on, especially under circumstances like what India is in now. So we cannot really say that let's forget about structuralist ways of thinking about how oppression works. We can't do that. It's politically inexpedient to do so. I mean, it's also irresponsible to do so. While at the same time, we know that there are limitations to structuralist thinking, and we have to make space for fantasy and imaginations of the impossible, so that we are able to survive the onslaught of structures of oppression. And and I use the word we quite loosely because I don't think all of us experience oppression in the same way. So many of us might be against Hindu nationalism. But we don't experience the onslaught of Hindu nationalism in the same way, right? We might be against caste, but we don't experience the onslaught of of caste oppression in the same way. We might be against patriarchy, but don't experience the onslaught of patriarchy in the same way. So, so what I'm suggesting is not a prescription for when to use a structuralist approach and when to suspend it. But it's a suggestion that it has to be a combination of both of these approaches in the way we think about political mobilization, including mobilization that aims at changing the law. I don't know, that was a really rambling response, but I hope I made sense.
No, thank you. That takes me actually to the next question that I had in mind. I think you mentioned briefly about how a form of alienation is created due to if we follow one approach over the other, and certain people are left out in the process. I think this is something similar to what we see the judiciary also doing right now, where there is a need to include queer identities in the nationalist project through invoking certain figures or Indian past to actually encompass everything and all that the queer movement is known for right now, or just saying that we already had a queer past. So I feel like this can also create a sense of alienation due to the kind of figures that are being invoked, where you're mentioning one certain religion or one certain caste over the other. So do you think it's a good idea for the judiciary to be including the supposed Indian queer past in the project that they are trying to further, or do you think it can lead to problems as well?
Well, again, I think it's a what does it mean to litigate for rights, irrespective of what the subject of litigation is? Simply put, the aim of litigating for rights is to be able to put forward a strategy that will convince the court that responding to the demands of the petitioners is important, or the other way around. Whoever is offering those strategies to the judges on the bench. And so it's not the judges who are necessarily thinking up this past. It's actually the petitioners who are offering those resources for the judges to think with. And so I think that's very important to keep in mind. And it was the same with the Nas judgments, the final judgment in Afte Johar. Every reference to a past that was made to sound resonant with current demands had to hark back to a past that was inclusive in the Indian context. And almost by default, you ended up harking back to a past that was Hindu. Right? Now, yes, it's problematic politically, but it seems to be expedient legally. Now, are the lawyers unaware of this? It would be too naive to say yes, they are. I'm sure they're aware of this, but they are following strategy. Their aim is to be able to convince the bench, and they'll marshal arguments accordingly. Would it be right to say that they are being irresponsible by strategizing arguments in this fashion under conditions where resurrecting a particular way of thinking about queer pasts, aligns that argument with the larger political project of Hindutva? I would say yes, there is some need for exercising caution there, because when that narrative enters the words of the judgment that then become public and then get archived for posterity, it offers legitimizing, resources for the Hindu right. So, but I don't think this plays out in such an easy fashion. because, a lot is at stake for the lawyers who are arguing in favor of marriage equality or who are arguing against 377. It's a high profile case. There was a lot of resources, thinking, energy had gone into making the case what it did. And you couldn't have possibly stepped back from that point, and you had to kind of use whatever you had to use to make your arguments compelling. But I do think if one has the vantage of distance, like most academics do, it is important to continuously point out these, fractures and slippery slopes. That, I think, is very much a part of academic responsibility. And we see, in the Indian context, both activists and academics who've done it time and again. But none of these activists and academics who've done it time and again have necessarily been close to the charmed circle of the key players in these legal campaigns. So think about Akhil Kang or Vikram or, Ashley Tellis, who's for a very, very long time been a very powerful critique of the so-called queer rights movement in India, and there are many others as well. In the North American context, for example, figures like Jasbir Puar, who've tried to make an argument about how queer rights demands are closely connected to a certain vision of US imperialism, and queer inclusivity is made conditional for white US queer citizens on the basis of their support for US imperialism, in US imperialistic policies in other parts of the world. So we know that, there are other instances of these very complicated arrangements that have played out elsewhere. And, India is seeing, similar, if not identical, formations emerge in the context of both the marriage equality petitions, but right from the beginning of the campaign against 377. So while it's important to recognize that the lawyers are under pressure to do what they have to do to win a case, and sometimes these make for good arguments that get then taken up by the judges, and those very resources get written into the judgments, those resources that are provided by the lawyers. But one also knows that that judgment can then eventually become a resource for the very people who you think are the ones who would oppose whatever that you've been fighting for, or use it in a way that they'll appropriate it for furthering their objectives. So just to think about it in this way, so two instances, one that I discuss in the chapter and one which is context specific to the marriage equality debates. So when the Kaushal judgment came out, which kind of dismissed the Delhi High Court NA's decision, of course there was a lot of gloom. It was a really sad moment for anybody who was involved in that process, in the anti-377 campaign. And immediately the Congress government came out with its election manifesto. This was right before the 2014 general elections. Comes out with its election manifesto saying that if they are brought to power, they will, read down 377 through a legislative move. Now, here you have queer rights affirmative position being taken by what one would consider a somewhat politically moderate political party. And it's the same Congress government that was at that very time when it was including a queer rights affirmative promise in their manifesto that was carrying out, armed violence against India's Adivasi populations through Operation Green Hunt. So you had Chidambaram as the Home Minister, both speaking for queer rights, at the same time justifying violence against Adivasis in the name of fighting Maoism. Now, that's the complicated story. And here I'm talking about the Congress government's, position, but it is an important question to ask, that why is it that the two most important achievements of legal reforms in the context of queer rights, if the marriage equality petitions actually succeed, the reading down of 377, and if they succeed, would have happened under the rule of a fascist government? Is this a matter of mere coincidence, or is there a connection there? And I think it's important to kind of keep that question alive without necessarily saying that the petition itself is useless. I think that petition is important. But when you place the petition in the larger context of what is happening, and think about the same Supreme Court at that's giving so much time and space to the marriage equality petitions, was the one who also delivered the deeply problematic EWS judgment, almost confirming that upper caste Hindus have a right to almost avenge the history of reservations in India, which was a social justice, constitutionally guaranteed right. It's the same court, while these petitions are happening, are also hearing the Bilkis Bano case, and one doesn't know what will come out of that. So it'll be important to see all of these in connection with each other rather than as separate incidents, to then analyze what happens to queer rights under these conditions. And so that's the kind of case I make in the book, not just in chapter 4, which is about queer politics, but in all other chapters as well, to kind of not see incidents of rights claims or violations as kind of exclusivist or events, but to kind of pay attention to the larger connections that produce the event and give it a certain kind of charge at a particular time and place.
Thank you, Professor. That was our last question. It's been a real pleasure having you with us, because I think it was really great, because when Smriti and I were going through your book, we were very actually excited to talk to you about the possibilities of questions which should come up. And it was a struggle to actually define the questions we were going to put forward, because of course we have limited time. So I think through the conversation we have had, we have addressed everything that we wanted to discuss, and that's been a great pleasure. So thank you so much.
Thank you for, I feel very humbled when students read the book for whatever reason. So you had to read it because you had to do this podcast, but the fact that I hope it wasn't an onerous read,
No.
because I put the book together with law students as my primary readers, because almost all of the ideas that are in the book emerged out of my teaching. And so, the classroom has been the most generative space behind these chapters. So it is always very, very humbling to hear that law students have read it. So thank you for both reading it and for this opportunity. I'm very grateful.